Greetings, friends of liberty. 'Tis not my habit in most circumstances to dawdle about conversationally, dwelling on the weather, whether we shall have the Queen's weather today, or hunch weather, with thunderplums galore, as the kilt-wearers say up on their highlands on the morrow. No, 'tis not my habit, my rather concerning myself with more important issues, such as the length of my ruffles. But I did want to briefly mention that at the turn of this century, and even earlier, there were at times periods of considerable chilliness and even frigidity during our normally mild English winters. The Royal Society for Improving Natural Knowledge has not yet ascertained the causes for this unusual frostiness. But whatever the reasons, we English naturally responded to this climatological adversity with our usual good cheer in holding what were called frost fairs, and with extensive ice skating on the Thames. And across the watery way, even the French, so I've heard, managed to adapt in their own Gallic fashion. Now, if we turn to the weather in your 21st century, we find, oddly enough, in your online encyclopedia Wikipedia, the complete graphical erasure of this little ice age and the medieval warming period as well. Their deceptive off-debunk hockey stick presentation is not science, but the dissemination of propaganda. Remember that when Wikipedia asks you for donations to keep them free from corporate influence. Both climatological phases at this very moment are missing from their temperature graphs, they justifying their errors by claiming that these were only regional manifestations. And that brings us to Bjorn Lomborg, well-known statistician, director of the Copenhagen Consensus Research Project, and a longtime debunker of climatological environmental errors, starting with his 2001 book, The Skeptical Environmentalist, now a classic. Lomborg here in False Alarm, How Climate Change Panic Costs Us Trillions, Hurts the Poor, and Fails to Fix the Planet, enters the lists yet again to demolish the latest enviro fallacies propagated by Leonardo, AOC, and sleepy, touchy, sniffy Joey. Lomborg begins by introducing one of his main themes, quotidian by now, how our culture has inculcated in so many of its citizens a wildly inaccurate and anxiety-provoking misconception, partially born of the ideologies nurtured and developed in the universities, that human civilization is under existential threat from global warming. This misconception, familiar, consists in young people becoming hysterical and not eating meat or having children. B, the media thoughtlessly passing on the wildest green tales without checking them or doing the slightest scientific due diligence. C, the priests of eco-catastrophes, authors like Bill McKibben in his book Falter, or David Wallace Wells with his The Uninhabitable Earth, contributing to spreading the false alarm. And finally, T, the governmental and intergovernmental institutions like the UN saying, we all know that the world faces a threat potentially more catastrophic than any other threat in human history, climate change and global warming. How does our author propose to combat all this misinformation? In 3 steps. By number 1, simply showing us the truth about the present environmental reality. Number 2, by showing us how not to spend all the money being raised through taxes. And 3, by giving us, in contrast, his own understanding of the best solutions available. Let's review his coverage in each of these 3 areas. First, the environmental reality, the truth about Gaia. Contrary to professional hysteric Greta Thunberg, Lomborg says, we are not on the brink of imminent extinction. In fact, quite the opposite. This means that, number 1, contrary to alarmists, like the aforementioned author David Wallace Wells, who states that coastal flooding caused by sea level rise will result in somewhere between 14 trillion and more than 100 trillion of damages every year by 2100. The reality instead is that if human beings invest even modest amounts, around 40 billion internationally, in increasing the protections offered by dikes and levees, then the cost by 2100 would actually be a smaller percentage of GDP than they are presently, going from 0.05% of GDP to 0.008, a reduction of over 6 times. As Lomborg notes, one of the obvious reasons that climate alarmists have made such inaccurate statements about flooding in comparing potential flood costs now to, let's say, the year 1900, is that the world population has increased so much, with only 1.6 billion people living in the world then and almost 8 billion now. As he says, in the US in 2017, there were 750% as many housing units to be damaged as there had been in 1903. And one thing he doesn't mention is that in the US, the government subsidizes insurance costs for beachfront living, thus incentivizing people to live in more dangerous coastal areas. John Stossel made a whole video on this and how he did it. Number 2, the potential for increased heat waves. While acknowledging that a greater frequency of heat waves would be negative, Lomborg notes importantly that cold weather is far more dangerous and kills more of the population. Cold usually kills because the body restricts blood flow to the skin, increasing blood pressure and lowering our defenses against infections. One large study found that while 140,000 people died from the heat each year, more than 2 million died from the cold. In Britain, presently, 33 people die from the cold each year compared to 1 from the heat. He notes that in a recent year, in January, in 1 week alone, 7,200 people were killed who wouldn't otherwise have died. Do you think climate alarmists will ever bother to point out this inconvenient truth? Number 3, the potential for increased fire damage. Lomborg notes the fact of the Pyrrhic transition. That is, over the last century in the developed world, hundreds of millions have transitioned from wood stoves and fireplaces with sooted chimneys and stovepipes to fossil fuels. What most people in the first world today don't know is that the single greatest source of worldwide pollution today is indoors, when poor people in the developing world use wood or dung to cook their meals, light their homes, and heat their dwellings. As a consequence, they suffer from constant smoke inhalation, with 1.6 million dying annually from this cause and related fires. Turning now to outdoor environmental fires, worldwide, we again generally find that the reality is far different than what the purple-haired Extinction Rebellion types would have us believe. As Lomborg says, satellites show a 25% reduction globally in burned area just over the past 18 years, from 1.9 million square miles to 1.4. However, as those in North America learned during the summer of 2023, in some places like Quebec and Maui, fires that might have been prevented with A, proper forestry management in Canada, and B, faulty electric company maintenance practices, in the case of Hawaii, led to these disasters, which liberals, of course, immediately attributed to global warming. The unfortunate fact, however, is that while for much of the 20th century, the number of forest fires in the U.S. was decreasing, it has recently risen over the last 30 years. This increase, again, due to faulty management practices of the U.S. Forest Service and power companies like Pacific Gas and Electric, whose negligence caused the horrific Camp Fire in Paradise, California, which killed 85 people and caused $16 billion in damage. We can see then how deadly ideologies are, in this case making liberals fundamentally misdirected in their attempts to understand and adapt to the world around them. 4. Increased airborne CO2. Because of the increased CO2 in the air And because airborne CO2 is, of course, a plant fertilizer, vegetation around the world is responding exactly the way that plants do when florists pump CO2 into greenhouses. Outdoors, just as indoors, we're getting massive worldwide greening of forests and vegetation, and a significant increase in crop production across the board. Greenies don't dare tell anyone about this, only wanting to harp on the potential costs of increasing airborne CO2, but not, of course, the benefits. As Lomborg says, the biggest satellite study to date, published in 2016, confirmed that over the past 3 decades, upwards of half the world's vegetated area is getting greener, whereas only 4% is browning. Number 5. Finally, let's conclude this section with some miscellaneous weather items. A. Hurricanes. Here, one of the fundamental drivers of the absolute amount of damage from the hurricanes is, as previously mentioned, increased human populations near the coasts. As Lomborg says, in the U.S., from Texas to Maine, the number of housing units within 31 miles of the coast increased from 4.4 million in 1940 to 26.6 million in 2000. This means that if we were going to graph the absolute amount of damage going back to 1900 and recalculate it based on 2019 population figures, what we get is basically a flat line indicating no change over the last century in hurricane damages when population is equalized. Of course, with increasing wealth, people can protect themselves more. So since hurricanes now on average account for just 0.04% of the U.S. GDP damage, in 2100, with GDP estimated to increase by 5 times, protection will be easier still. B. Ocean acidification. The effect on fishing would be negligible. 0.0075% of global GDP by 2200. Even now, already over half of all fishing is done with aquaculture. C. Estimations of total costs and benefits. Economist William Nordhaus won a Nobel for his decades-long work estimating the net economic effects of global warming. His conclusion was approximately a 2.9% decline in world GDP from the huge 5-fold increase it will be if, by the year 2100, the average temperature increases by 7 degrees Fahrenheit and we do nothing more. So if we zoom in on something like agriculture, one study showed that an increase in global cereal production of 44% without global warming and 41% with global warming. So no big deal. What is the likelihood of something catastrophic happening, like the Greenland ice sheet melting? As Lomborg says, if it happened within a lifetime, that would be catastrophic. However, the UN Climate Panel finds that even with a very large amount of heat, it will take a millennium or more to melt all of Greenland's ice. So even with relatively rapid melting, Nordhaus estimates a rather trivial impact by the end of the century at 0.012% of GDP. Let's now turn to section 2, what not to do. Essentially, don't do it extreme green, or often even medium or mini green too. As Lomborg says, the United Nations revealed that the last decade of climate policies has achieved a sum total of nothing. Let's review some of these failed strategies both at the individual and societal level. Number 1, unplugging cell phones when not in use only reduces emissions by 1/1000th. Number 2, walking instead of taking the train means we emit much more carbon dioxide because trains aren't big emitters per mile, and we save a lot of money that we then spend on other things. By the way, that's called a rebound effect. People spending some of the money that they've saved on purchasing other carbon items. Number 3, eliminating meat. it will reduce your personal emissions by the equivalent of 1,191 pounds of carbon dioxide per year. For the average person, that means an emissions cut of just 4.3%. And that's again before the rebound effect, which reduces it by half. So 2% reduction in emissions if you go vegan and reward yourself. 4. Electric cars. Since more CO2 is used in making them, they have to be run a while to break even. Meaning on average, electric cars only save 24% on emissions compared to gasoline cars over their lifetime. Number 5. Cutting air travel? No. Even if every single one of the 4.5 billion people getting on any flight this year stayed on the ground, and the same happened every year until 2100, the rise in temperatures would be reduced by just 0.05 degrees Fahrenheit by 2100. Number 6, renewables. So much has been said about them already elsewhere that they require a whole fossil fuel backup system because the sun doesn't always shine and wind blow, that meaningful battery storage for the grid to overcome this hurdle is nowhere in sight, the present capacity nationwide in the US being 14 seconds of coverage in an outage, the enormous environmental damage to birds and perhaps whales and perhaps human beings with their infrasound emissions, the blighting of the land or seascape, and the huge amounts of acreage they consume that could be used productively. As Lomborg summarizes, we are constantly being told that solar and wind are just about to take over the world. This is almost entirely wishful thinking. Or as Jim Hansen, former head of the NASA Goddard Space Institute, said, suggesting that renewables will let us phase rapidly off fossil fuels is almost the equivalent of believing in the Easter Bunny and Tooth Fairy. Number 7, the alleged example of green Germany. That country is now, probably partially as a result, in the midst of a recession, and electricity costs have doubled over the past 2 decades and are now at 35 cents per kilowatt hour, almost 3 times the US average. Want to kill your national industrial capacity? Copy Germany. 8. Wood as a renewable? No, it often emits even more carbon than coal when transportation costs are factored in. And the hope that new trees planted in their place will suck up more CO2, as Lomborg says, is dubious accounting at best. 9. Lomborg finishes this section by comparing a green suite of environmental strategies for the world until 2100 with a fossil fuel strategy. Here are the comparisons in 2100. Going down the green pathway, the average person in the world will be 6 times as rich in 2100. Average income will be $106,000, but down the fossil fuel pathway, the average person will be 10.4 times as rich. Each person would earn $182,000 per year. This is $76,000 more than the green scenario. Multiplying this difference by the number of people in the world expected to live in 2100 amounts to an annual difference of 509 trillion greater world GDP in 2100 for the fossil fuel scenario. It should be noted that Lomborg provides examples again and again and again of how green policies hurt the poorest the most because they have the least financial ability to adapt to destructive green policies. A typical example here was the biofuels craze in 2007 and onward, which resulted in enormous rises of food prices for people in poor countries, which happened because world food supply was being used very inefficiently to make ethanol. As Lomborg says, the results of the price hike were devastating. After food prices first spiked in 2008, the UN Special Envoy declared that a silent tsunami had pushed 100 million people into poverty and 30 million into hunger. That's green compassion in action. Finally, let's turn to his fourth section, solutions. What, if anything, shall we do about the gradual rise in temperatures? Number one, Lomborg starts with the idea of carbon taxes, arguing that they're great in theory but would be a nightmare in practice to try to enforce rigorously among the hundreds of countries throughout the world. And this makes them unworkable to any large scale. As he says, the optimal climate policy requires a globally coordinated carbon tax, and that is possible only in a fairy tale world. Nonetheless, he believes that it can be a small part of our solution to climate change if implemented selectively. I doubt it. Number two, so for getting a carbon tax, what would be the best way overall then? Innovation, which has driven the rise of the West's and its civilizational brilliance since the Industrial Revolution. A. Lomborg points out that the way that whales were saved from extinction in the West in the 19th century was simply because we innovated and discovered, instead of using whale oil for lighting our homes, how to use kerosene instead. Similarly, before the turn of the last century, there was a fear that all of London would be covered with horse manure because of the ever-increasing use of horse-drawn carriages. And what happened? Along came the German Karl Benz, displaying that love of cars and their manufacture that Germans have manifested ever since. Manure problem solved. Smog in Los Angeles in the 60s? The catalytic converter was invented. Hunger throughout the developing world in the 1960s? Agronomist Norman Borlaug essentially started the so-called Green Revolution with his development of strains of dwarf wheat and rice, saving by some estimates the lives of hundreds of millions. As Lomborg summarizes, the lesson from history is clear. When we innovate and find a cheap technological solution, we solve major challenges and generate broadly shared benefits. B. But next, unfortunately, Lomborg the liberal goes a bit astray and argues that government should fund innovation. As an example, he says that the development of fracking in the U.S., which has helped reduce U.S. greenhouse emissions significantly, was supported by hundreds of millions of dollars from the U.S. Department of Energy and perhaps $10 billion in production tax credits for private entrepreneurs. He wants this government support for climatological R&D to be expanded, saying we need to take this experience and look for other areas where the government can support innovation to ease our transition away from fuels with a high carbon dioxide footprint. In this, I think he's mistaken. And this is because government has, in most cases, not been the cause of breakthrough technologies. To the contrary, it is private science, or more private science, that tends to be more successful. Most of the examples he just gave involving whales, automobiles, and catalytic converters were, to my knowledge, privately developed. Regarding fracking, I think that in the U.S. that would have had a free market energy policy, with universities independent of government funding, fracking would have been developed even earlier than it was around 2008. Private science and industry throughout history has constantly been the most productive, as in Edison's light bulb and his other inventions, many private medical discoveries of the 19th and 20th century. The airplane, developed privately by the Wright brothers at 1/10 of the cost that the governmentally funded Smithsonian Institute's plane, irrespective of the fact that Langley's airplane was garbage. And the mapping of the human genome by Craig Ventnor at Celera, again accomplished at a fraction of the cost and 10 times the speed of the federal program. All of these examples indicated that if you want the maximum chance of the development of useful knowledge, you want to keep the government as far away from the science as is humanly possible. In addition, the government can destroy any established science it gets its hands on, in the way that it has made nuclear energy de facto illegal and its research de facto unproductive, by heaping huge amounts of regulation onto the industry so no one hardly bothers to make nuclear power plants or research their technology anymore.
C. Finally, to wrap up this section on solutions, he mentions A, how air capture of carbon is presently not feasible, saying air capture today is so expensive that it cannot yet be a serious part of our response. B, he mentions how various geoengineering solutions are both potentially effective, but given their present riskiness, should only now be researched more. C, with regarding to planting more trees, he says there is not enough land on the planet to actually capture all the excess carbon dioxide, and moreover, we need land for agriculture. And finally, D, he discusses cost-effective solutions to flooding, like early warning systems, and cost-effective solutions to urban heating by using light-colored asphalt and painting the rooftops of buildings white. So in conclusion, the only flaw that I can find in this book is his misunderstanding about the ability of governmental R&D compared to private to discover and develop breakthrough technologies. In addition, I would mention that even William Nordhaus's Nobel Prize-winning research, given the huge unpredictability of technological progress, will likely end up being fairly inaccurate. No one, for example, could have predicted the success of fracking. Instead, everyone is talking about peak oil. And likewise, no one, even William Nordhaus, can predict what path-breaking, game-changing technologies will have emerged in the 80 years, but to the year 2100. Otherwise, this book is filled with many great arguments and backed by hundreds of stats and graphs, with which Lomborg's common sense and understanding enlighten us time and again. I would give it an A-. And that reminds me that with this chilly London weather, I need to put yet another log on the fire. I bid you well and remain the Scarlet Pimpernel.